We are at the end of the Nakba al-mustamirra rather than the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing Nakba. I think, can such a situation continue for long? Namely, that a narrative is not anymore regarded as valid, as viable, but is seen as sheer propaganda. And yet, because of more cynical interests, the state that concocts this narrative will still be supported. There is a need for Palestinian unity. But in order to stop the killing, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the unity you need is not the Palestinian unity. You need the unity of the world.
Welcome to the Floodgate podcast, brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. We are here to engage with today's most pressing issues and unpack them beyond the cliches of mainstream media. I'm your host, Ramzi Baroud, and with me in the studio is the brilliant Romana Rubio, an Italian journalist and the managing editor of the Palestine Chronicle.
Thank you, Ramzi. And joining us today is a special guest, a world-renowned historian, Professor Ilan Pappe. Professor Pappe teaches at the University of Exeter. He is the author of several books, including The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, The Modern Middle East, 10 Myths About Israel, and Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic. He is the co-editor of Our Vision for Liberation. Professor Pappe is the director of the Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Professor Pappe, thank you so much for taking the time and welcome to our show.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Romana and Ramzi, in this podcast. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Of course, Ilan. Now, I just want to keep up with the academic style here a bit by starting with basic definitions, or rather a single definition. Many people are referring to the genocide in Gaza, in fact, the unprecedented Israeli violent campaign throughout the West Bank, as well as a second Nakba. Now, it's an obvious reference why it's being called the second Nakba. You are looking at millions of Palestinians who are being displaced throughout Gaza, and now tens of thousands of families in the West Bank through a decided Israeli violent campaign. But there are also obvious differences. The first Nakba saw the displacement of Palestinians outside Palestine and presented the Zionist movement, later the State of Israel, as the party in charge. It had a plan. The plan had a name, Plan Dalet, which repercussions carried on for decades. As a historian who has brilliantly documented the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, how do you see or evaluate this term, the second Nakba? Is it a proper depiction of the ongoing events?
Well, for me, I'm still quite, I think, taken or convinced by the Palestinian reference to the whole period from 1948 until today as the ongoing Nakba, in Arabic, al-Nakba al-mustamirra. There's something in it because if I judge the Israeli policies according to motive, objective, strategy that is being fed by a certain ideology, then I think that the whole period is an attempt by the settler-colonial movement of Zionism and later by the State of Israel to eliminate the Palestinians as a people, as a country, as an idea. Now, of course, historically, it doesn't occur on a big scale every moment in history. You need certain historical circumstances that would convince the leaders of the settler-colonial movement and later the State of Israel that there is a rare historical opportunity to advance the objective by a more drastic action. So the circumstances around 1948, the British withdrawal from Palestine, the fact that this was very close to the Holocaust in Germany, the trouble that the Arab world had in it, the fact that the colonized world was still not part of the international community, all that provided this idea among the Zionist leaders that 1948 was a very good opportunity, a very good time to try and expel people on a massive scale, ethnic cleansing on a massive scale. We have a similar action in 1967. It was a short war and it didn't enable Israel to do much. But within the 6 days, people keep forgetting it. Israel expelled three refugee camps near Jericho, expelled the people who lived in East Jerusalem, especially in the Muslim quarter. And all in all, 300,000 Palestinians were expelled during 1967. And uh, October 2023, in the eyes of the current Israeli leaders, was another historical moment to advance the settler-colonial basic eliminatory policy. And therefore, we see this massive, not only expulsion, but of course killing that is genocidal in part. But as you both know, I already claimed in 2010 that the Israeli policies towards the Gaza Strip within the project of siege and blockade was an incremental genocide. And if I look back at the Israeli actions before that, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and even inside Israel itself towards Palestinians, you can also call it incremental ethnic cleansing over the years. So I think we are looking at the same event, if you want, but it has moments of peak, more drastic, more barbaric, more ruthless, more terrible moments. But unfortunately, and this is the history of modern Palestine since the arrival of Zionism, this is a reality that began to unfold in the late 19th century, but is still with us now in 2025.
And in your article, Palestine Chronicle, published on October 10, 2023, so just 3 days after October 7, you actually warned the Israelis. You mentioned that the longer the Israeli oppression continued, and I quote here, the less likely the liberation struggle would be sterile in the face, of course, of the elimination of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government. And you also suggested that despite the bias in mainstream Western media, the truth would eventually emerge about the motives that led to the October 7 attack. So, looking at the situation now, do you believe that the global perception of Israeli actions has indeed shifted? And also, have we seen a change in how the world views the Israel's treatment of Gaza and Palestine, especially in light of the ongoing genocide?
Yeah. I think that, Romana, it's very difficult to generalize about it. I think that as far as the civil society is concerned, alternative media, social media, anything that is not directly connected to establishments or controlled by establishments, and this includes also individuals in academic institutions. I think that the context of the 7th of October, as well as the events unfolding after the 7th of October, is far better understood than it was in the very beginning. I think people began to read more, to be more educated. I can say personally that I can see it in the rise in the demand for the book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that I wrote in 2007. Suddenly, for people who are relatively newcomers to this whole area and catastrophe, they suddenly it resonated with them that there is a history here that you have to know in order to understand what happened. And in this respect, the narrative that Israel and its allies propagated, namely that the 7th of October is just an act directed from Tehran to destroy the Jewish state, I think in the minds of quite a lot of educated people and interested people in the global civil society is not catching, is not accepted. The problem is, and we still have the same problem as we had it on the 10th of October 2023, as we have it today, I'm afraid, that quite a lot of people who know the context actually, who are not stupid or not ignorant, who are holding key positions in the mainstream media, in mainstream academia, definitely in the mainstream politics, especially in the global West. And surprisingly, especially in countries like Italy, France, Germany, Belgium. I mean, there are some better cases within West Europe, but also countries in Central Europe, of course, whether it is the Czech Republic or Hungary. There, I'm afraid, uh, the context is ignored and denied. Again, not because people are convinced that the context we provided in this, I provided in this article, and so many of us in our articles in Palestine Chronicles and elsewhere have provided the general public with, not because they think that this is not a valid analysis, but because they are loyal to the Israeli or to the global alliance that provides immunity for Israel. And part of the immunity is not just weapons and financial aid, is protecting a narrative that is demanded by Israel in order to silence any criticism or undermining Israel's international legitimacy.
And if I may just follow on that question, Professor Pape, do you feel that that narrative, because that narrative was crafted, I don't want to say in the most brilliant way, but there was no counter-Palestinian narrative for many, many years, not until later with the rise of Palestinian intellectuals in Western academia, but also within national liberation movements and creating this intellectual intersectionality in the global South and all of that. But for years, Palestinians were absent from any counter-narrative. And now you have access to Palestinian voices like never before. Is the Israeli narrative still safe as far as the Zionists are concerned, or is it being demolished? Are we talking about a kind of an earth-shattering event happening here, as far as the Israeli discourse is concerned?
Yes, I do think it is undermined like never before. I don't know if it's eliminated or so on. I try to be cautious here, but I have no um, I have no doubt that the fact that the only way to protect it now is through intimidation, through silencing people, through weaponization of anti Semitism and allegations of supporting terrorism, shows you the weakness of the narrative. Because I think if you go back to the 1980s or the 1990s, to the period where you rightly say it was difficult to produce the counter narrative, or at least to have support for the counter narrative. The counter narrative was there. In those days, the allies or the people who subscribed to that narrative, at least some of them believed that it had a moral validity, that there was a scholarly foundation for that narrative. I don't see it anymore. I don't see even an attempt to validate academically or morally the Israeli narrative. What I see is a huge attempt to destroy the other narrative by means that are not academic and not moral, but through intimidation. And that shows you that something is very unsafe there, as you rightly put it, for the narrative. This is a huge question, of course. Uh, can such a situation continue for long? Namely, that a narrative is not anymore regarded as valid, as viable, but is seen as sheer propaganda. And yet, because of more cynical interests, the state that concocts this narrative will still be supported, regardless of the fabrication of historical facts or the invalidity of the narrative. But as terrible as it is, of course, for anyone in Palestine now, I think in the long run, this gap between the validity of the narrative and the power used to sustain it is something positive for the Palestinians to think about. In unfortunately, not immediately, not for tomorrow or the day after, but in the longer term. I think that's one of few indications that we are at the end of the Nakba al-mustamirra rather than the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing Nakba. I think we are at the last chapter of the ongoing Nakba. Always can be a very dangerous, very ruthless, and as an historian, I know it's can be a long, unfortunately, a long-term chapter for people who live today. But I think but it is also a closing chapter that will not survive later on, to my mind.
And Ramzi, before you move to maybe more geopolitical considerations, I would just follow up on this, saying that in another article you wrote for the Palestine Chronicle, you spoke about the campaigns targeting, Palestinian Muslim students or whomever stood in solidarity with Palestine. And since then, we have observed a growing erosion of, democratic spaces and also of academic freedom. Universities are increasingly expelling students, censoring books, events, initiatives, often, as you reminded, weaponizing accusations of anti-Semitism or even labeling any support for Palestine as terrorism. So do you believe that Gaza is, eventually exposing the hypocrisy, not only of the so-called liberal democracies, but also of this, superiority of the West? And, what do you see as the dangers of this trend?
Yeah, I think, Romana, what it exposes more than anything else is something we experience, but on not such a large scale, after 9/11, after the attack on 9/11. Uh, Among the so-called liberal democracies, there are always elements, either in the security services, in the governments, in the darker sides of government, one can call it, who are not happy with liberties of people. But nothing to do directly with Gaza or Palestine, but as a whole, they are not happy with not only liberties, but for instance, in the West, with the multicultural, multi-ethnic fabric of the West, that of course gives a different content to liberties. It's much more a need for a dialogue, a mosaic of ideas, and so on, and not just imposing one concept of liberal democracy on everyone. That in a Western society that became far more multicultural, multi-ethnic than it was before the age of colonialism and imperialism. And these particular forces always exploit moments in history, like the one we have seen on the 7th of October 2023, to claim that this is a good moment to clamp down, to limit liberties, to force the more narrow-minded kind of Western European idea on anyone who is not exactly part of that tradition or culture. And this is used immediately after such an event under the guise of fighting terrorism, danger to national security. As I wrote in one of the articles in Palestine Chronicle, it's not surprising that, at least in Britain, where I examined it more properly, the people are mainly targeted by such forces, whether they are in the media or in the government. These victims are usually women of color, women who are not white, if you want, uh, in the eyes of the establishment. I'm not using it as an objective definition, of course, but women who are Muslims or Arabs or Africans, who are students, who are vocal, who are brave, because they seem to be more vulnerable, more easy to target. Uh, uh, and uh, and this is part of the same idea that they want to redefine the boundaries of what is freedom of expression, what is freedom of protest, uh, and and uh, and in the process they are destroying the positive side of liberal democracies. I mean, I'm not someone who always negates any system. I do believe human political systems are complex issues, and they have bad and good sides to it. But this process destroys the more positive sides that Western societies have contributed, if you want, to the world. So they are sort of digging their own hole in it. And in the process, what is quite incredible is the way that very democratic ideas, even democratic ideas that are expressed with regard not only to the future of the West, but also to the future of Palestine, are framed as terrorism. I mean, you take the most, I think, the most hopeful, most positive idea of people being equal in a future state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, that is defined in some countries that if you are chanting it as a slogan, support for terrorism. Or if someone like our dear friend, an ex-Israeli 81-year-old activist in London, Chaim Bereshit, who talked as who is also a scholar and talks about the fact that anti-colonialist movements, according to international law, have the right to defend themselves, and he's immediately being arrested after saying that. I mean, these are only manifestation of the problem. That's not the issue itself, but it's a manifestation of how there is a clear connection between a genuine, moral, authentic position towards Palestine in general and Gaza in particular, and the future of our freedoms, of the stability of our societies, of the welfare of our societies, also in the West, and the events over there in Palestine.
Thank you for that, Ilan. If we could just talk about Israeli society itself. I mean, just following what's happening in the media right now, you kind of get a lot of information about what the Israeli government is saying, what an ex-official Galant, the new chief staff, Halevi, investigations by the Shabak, by others, and also statements coming from the families of Israeli captives in Gaza. But you really don't get a true analysis of what is happening in Israeli society after October 7. Why is Netanyahu able to keep it together for this long? How is the far right and the extremists in so much in charge in a society that had, and I'm talking relatively speaking here,
Yeah, yeah,
had an element of liberal Zionism and
absolutely.
democratic initiative and that sort of thing?
Yeah,
How are they able to do it? You did speak about an implosion, an impending implosion
yeah,
in Israeli society. If you could talk about this and elaborate
yeah,
just a bit, that
yeah.
would be great.
Definitely, there is an historical process here, and we see a culmination of that process. And therefore, I myself am not surprised by that phenomenon. Namely, the idea that a settler colonial society can really provide a moral viewpoint that is liberal, universal, socialist, one that is also loyal to global ideas and not just to the settler colonial ideology of eliminating the native. The idea that that the ideology of the settler colonial movement and the more universal values that genuinely some of its members really would like to believe in, the idea that this can be fused together into a viable ideological interpretation of Zionism could never work. As I like to say, you cannot be a liberal colonizer. Albert Mami wrote about it quite well. You cannot be a progressive ethnic cleanser, and you cannot be a socialist genocider. You can't do it. So I think there is something unworkable, even if, and you rightly, and I think we should say it because we don't want to demonize everyone, even when there was a good intention behind it, because not all 8 million Jews who live in Israel are nasty people. Uh, it's impossible unless you are willing to liberate yourself, as I did, as someone who was born as an Israeli Jew, from the Zionist ideology. If you don't do that, there is a limit to how much you can square the circle, how much you can overcome this cognitive dissonance. So I think what happened is that for many Israeli Jews over the years, they, they were exhausted by this exercise of trying to be both liberals, if you want, and ethnic cleansers or genocider and so on. So there were few options here. One was to leave, and the numbers are keep growing of people who, they want to live their own life in a normal, relatively normal environment, and that kind of challenge is something they don't want to deal with. Because if you want to deal with it, you have to be an activist, or you can't just let it by. And we've seen that now that this crisis comes, and that's what the 7th of October did. It exposed the impossibility of being a Zionist and a Democrat, a Zionist and a liberal. That is now totally exposed. So one option was to leave, to say, okay, I will move to another place. A second option, which a very small minority of people have chosen, but I'm glad that some of them did, is to become an anti-Zionist and to struggle with the Palestinians for their rights. And then there is the third option that happened in settler-colonial movements historically, and by that also leading to that last chapter that I'm talking about, where you give up on the attempt to subscribe to international to global values, to moral values of humanity, and so on. And this is the power base of Netanyahu. Whether it is settlers from the West Bank, whether it is unfortunate, more deprived socioeconomically sections of the Israeli Jew society, mostly a third generation of North African Jews, whether it is the more nationalist sections of the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So it creates a kind of a coalition that has this mixture of their own interpretation of Judaism, of romantic nationalism, and believe in the genocidal, eliminatory objectives of a settler-colonial movement. It was definitely powerful enough to bring him to power several times since 2009. I still want to see whether it's enough to sustain him in power after everything that happens on the 7th of October. But I wouldn't put it beyond him, given the development in the Israeli Jewish society, especially unfortunately, among the younger generation, among those who are now graduating from the Israeli educational system. Given also the shift in the Israeli media, the main media that sometimes had some more liberal side to it, more critical voices. It talks in one voice now, supporting the genocide, dehumanizing the Palestinians wherever they are. Not to mention what's happening in synagogues in Israel, which used to be a place of prayer. It's now a community center where rabbis are using even a tougher language in support of genocide and racism than even you can hear in the official Israeli media. So all of this means that even if Netanyahu is disliked maybe more than ever before, even in his power base, what he represents will remain, to my mind, the hegemonic ideology in Israel. So we have to separate between his personal issues, even with some of his supporters, and the ideology of this alliance that he built that is powerful. So he may be weakened, but again, I would hesitate to say something final about it. I would wait for this with this, but definitely the kind of ideologies that sustains the Israeli apartheid state today is the one that is winning and is destroying whatever remained of the more genuine or cynical, doesn't matter, attempt to have a more liberal, democratic side to the Zionist project.
in a recent interview with Anadolu, you emphasized that we have to make sure that the reconstruction of Gaza is not an American show or a capitalist show, you said, but rather part of a Palestinian-led project of decolonization. And you also highlighted something very specific, that the reconstruction must go beyond mere rebuilding. You said it must be political, and you advocated for greater unity around the Palestinian cause and more support from the Muslim world and the global South. So if you could elaborate on this,
Yeah.
Keeping in mind that, Arab and Muslim countries, many of them are also American allies, and they have not truly showed, tangible solidarity with Palestine beyond some press statements. And, even the Cairo summit, was it enough? Did it meet Palestinian expectations?
Probably not. Yeah. I think it's a very important point. I will use a terrible metaphor, but I think it helps to understand what is wrong with this whole language of reconstruction that we hear connected to the language of the day after. One of the things that really shocked me when I began to understand the Israeli system of oppression, especially in the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, was the role played by Israeli doctors in places where people were tortured or people suffered from the conditions of being in Israeli prison. And they used to treat the Palestinian victims and send them back to the torture, send them back to the prison. Reconstructing Gaza without dealing with the problem of where Israel is today, ideologically and morally and internationally, without asking ourselves what is the future of the Palestinians, giving the declared objective of the state of Israel towards them, is like treating someone, healing them for a while, but sending them back to the hell that is today a modern Palestine. If you don't deal with the ethnic cleansing that takes now place in the West Bank, which is part of a program to annex Area C and to push Palestinians to the enclaves of Area A and B, if you don't deal with the intensified Judaization that nobody's talking about in East Jerusalem, where the first time during Ramadan, Israel is now demolishing homes, which even that they tried not to do in the past, and now they feel that they have a carte blanche to do that. Not to mention, of course, what's happening in Gaza. If you don't deal with what we would call in international law transitional justice or restorative justice, then you are creating the same misunderstanding that the Oslo Accord created, that there is a talk of reconciliation, a talk of a solution, which actually only tries to help the oppressor and the occupier to have an easier ride in terms of its international legitimacy, in terms of its maybe even expenditure, because it costs a lot of money to occupy and oppress. And I think that's my great fear. Now, as for the Arab and Muslim world, you're absolutely right about the state themselves. But and Ramsey is far more experienced on this than I am. But being in Malaysia, for instance, and now talking a lot with people in Indonesia for the first time, with the Muslim minority in Thailand and in the Philippines, having few webinars in Pakistan as well, not to mention the Muslim community in South Africa. I don't accept it that they are helpless in front of their own governments when it comes to Palestine. I mean, the sense that what can we do? This is what our political elites want to do. They want to be in good terms with America. So don't expect any dramatic shifts in the way we deal with Palestine. I don't accept it. I think if it's so, and it should be so important for your identity as a human being, first of all, as a human being, but surely also as a Muslim, it should be so important for your identity and your understanding of your place in the world that it can't be just brushed aside by the fact that what can I do? I mean, That's what my government is doing. So I hear from the younger generation there a different music, a different lyrics. So I do hope that they will push towards demanding a role which is not being subcontractors of the Americans, but being the people who listen to the Palestinians, what they need, what they want, and help them to facilitate it by being important actors on the international scene.
Speaking of the international scene, Professor Pape, recently we had Scott Ritter with us on the show. And the romantic Palestinian in me is still kind of thinking of the Soviet era, and maybe the Soviets will come to the rescue, that sort of thing. So I
Mhm.
did ask him about Russia, and his answer was, because let's be frank, I mean, the Russian position, yes, there is a war in Ukraine and all of that, but it really wasn't as valuable or as critical as we wanted it to be, to kind of create this balance and take advantage of the geostrategic or the geopolitical change of political currents in the region and beyond the region. And his answer was, what do you want from Russia? What do you expect from Russia? If Palestinians are not united, what can Russia do? And that, of course, takes us to a whole different subject of how do you even define unity? I mean, how can those who resist in any forms of resistance unify with those who collaborate with the enemy? It gets complicated from there. How can a country like Russia, a country like China, these new emerging global powers, place themselves in the region and push back against American hegemony, of course, to the benefit of Palestinians?
Yeah. First of all, I think that this argument that what do you want from Russia if the Palestinians are not united is a bit misleading because there is a need for Palestinian unity, but the need for the unity is not in order to save the Palestinians from the current existential danger that they experience, but for building what will come after that existential danger would be removed. There would be a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of things we can already think about and talk about when you talk about decolonization. It's not just to end the colonial rule, but also talk openly of what would replace it. And for that, you need unity. But in order to stop the killing, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the unity you need is not the Palestinian unity. You need the unity of the world. What saved the ANC was not its unity. What saved eventually the ANC, apart from its own struggle, of course, was that eventually a unity in the world unfolded, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, with regard to the invalidity or illegitimacy of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So I think we should not use the lack of unity, or whatever that means, as an excuse for powerful actors in the international scene not to act and defend the Palestinians. So that's one point. The second point is that uh, there are two ways, I think, in which Russia and China can play a role. One is maybe clear and obvious. Countries that have their own issues with human rights and civil rights are always much more effective when they are also improving their own record of human rights and civil rights. But before that happened, and these are complex and transformative processes that will take place, but of course, the Palestinians don't have the time to wait for them to mature. And in that moment, there is a way of using the United Nations, using the international economic transactions and economy, the global economy, to create far more conducive circumstances for the solidarity movement with the Palestinians to send this tough message to Israel that there is a price tag attached to their policies. Not just because there are demonstrations, not that because an Israeli singer here or there is boycotted or an academic event is not taking place, but because there is a hefty economic price to be paid for such a policy. They have the power to do it. They have the power to negotiate with other countries in the West, for instance, especially now that President Trump is rearranging the geopolitical alliances in the world on purely, it seems, capitalist economic system without any ideology or moral values, to use that to negotiate in a way that can alleviate at least some of the suffering of the Palestinians. Of course, their own societies should demand this and pressure for this. But I think this is important. And finally, I would say another point, and you may agree with me. I think the Palestinians as a national movement, as people who would be united more, united less, wherever the moment comes that they are feeling as a nation, as a movement, that they are now in a position to enter conversations about the future, would rather have these conversations mediated and even facilitated by China and Russia than the United States and Europe. And because the record of Europe, the record of the United States in the guise as honest brokers is so dismal, is such a betrayal that it will take a generation before the Palestinians would say, we trust any European or American diplomat to help us build together with whoever is willing to build with us a future that would prevent more violence and so on. But when these people would come from the global south, whether they would come from the countries we call BRIC, I think there is a far more willingness among the Palestinians to say, yes, you can help us. You can help us do it. But the West lost its right to be in that position.
Thanks, Ilan. And Romana, I will try to conclude here because I know how busy Professor Pappe is, and and he's been quite generous with his time. Just remaining focused on the issue of the future, and I will try to make this brief. When we watched a million Palestinian going back from southern Gaza to the north, or central and southern Gaza to the north, I mean, you can't fake a moment like this. You can't manufacture a moment like this. This utter sense of delight and joy and victory. And yet you talk to them, and then you realize that woman who's going back with a single child has already lost a husband and four other children. Yet she is still happy that they feel something innate in them, that something has fundamentally changed in the relationship between them and the Israeli. Yet if you kind of see this, the depiction of these moments outside quite often is missing the point, is missing the power of the people, the sumud. We speak about the sumud of it as if it's an academic subject, but
Yeah,
it is something real, so real that we have seen manifest itself in Gaza in a sense that took us all by surprise. When you look at the outcome of all of this, and whatever Palestinians achieved, and whatever sense of victory that they have managed to obtain as a result of all of this, who do you think are the actors that were responsible for this? Is it the international solidarity movement? Is it what's happening at the ICC and the ICJ? Is it the Palestinians themselves? And I believe this question is important in the sense that if certain actors are disproportionately relevant to this change that is happening in the relationship between Palestine and Israel, we need to invest more in that actor. Who are the most fundamental actors in your opinion? And
yeah. I
sorry
think
for the long
no. I
question.
think it's a crucial question. One of the things that you analyze as a historian, ever since I would say 1918 at least, with regard to who are the stakeholders when it comes to discussion on the future of historical Palestine, is the thing that strikes you is the invisibility of the Palestinians
Mhm.
in the eyes of those who claim to be the facilitators of the conversations about the future. And it doesn't matter at which historical moment you look, the Palestinians are not there. So, first and foremost, it's so clear that the Sumud is a huge victory on the invisibility, in fighting the invisibility of the Palestinians, not only in the eyes of the occupier and the colonizer, that goes without saying, but also in the eyes of those who claim to be the mediators, the facilitator of peace, so-called peace and solutions. And therefore, uh, uh, the hopefully the conclusion would be that the failure of any and all the attempts have failed since 1918, all the attempts to reconcile the idea of solving a European problem of anti-Semitism by imposing a European Jewish state on the heart of the Arab world and on Palestine. Any attempt to reconcile this impractical, immoral idea with what people would call peace or reconciliation, all these attempts failed exactly because the Palestinians were invisible in all these attempts, were irrelevant, was at best were supposed to be recipients of dictates that come from the outside. So even logically, even if it's not a moral issue for people, even logically, you would say to yourself, it failed because they were not visible. It failed because they were not the driver of the conversation of their own future. So they have to be the ones who are talking about it. And yes, it's not easy to find the unified, if you want, delegation or representation that would do it. But I think this is dialectically connected. This is totally connected. You have a disfranchised, disempowered Palestinian representation because this is the rule of the game, that the Palestinians are not important, are not relevant, they're just the recipients of ideas. The moment the international community would say the Palestinians are leading the conversation about the future, this will also, to my mind, activate far more positive processes inside the Palestinian society about unity, about clear presentation, a clear vision, being more loyal to the basic Palestinian idea, partitioning your own homeland and giving 80% of that land to, at best, to the settler-colonial movement and being happy with two Bantustans cannot be a genuine position of the national liberation movement. So when you are asking the national liberation movement, lead us into the future. Talk with everyone else, of course. They're not exclusively the interlocutors, but the main ones. That also will activate, to my mind, positive processes also of what the West would call unity or clear representation. And I think that should be our effort to make these voices heard, to make this demand being heard. I was very impressed with this. I would end with the initiative in Oslo, which I hope will continue, by the relentless Mads Gilbert, we all love and like. And his idea, and I think it was a good idea, to say to the people in Oslo, you are associated in the minds of the Palestinians with, with trickery, with betrayal, the Oslo Accord. Maybe Oslo would lead the way of conveying to the Europeans the message you are not the facilitators of peace, you are leading the campaign in Europe to defend the Palestinians and their rights. And that's the kind of conversation, that kind of language that we should hope would be the dominant one and the prevalent one. And I think that can create a different idea of who is leading the way towards the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Ilan Pappe. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us and for your incredible scholarship and tireless efforts in the pursuit of justice in Palestine. And to
Thank
all of our viewers, we appreciate you tuning in. The best way to push back against censorship is by engaging directly with our content. So please like, share, comment, and follow. From me and my co host, Romano Rubio, we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of The Floodgate. Thank you.